Good morning. My name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And I welcome you all to this release of our report, Humanitarian Protection in the Region, a State of Emergency. This is the North and Central American Task Force on Migration. There are several institutions joining this effort. The World Refugee and Migration Council, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Migration Policy Institute, El Colegio de México, and the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UCSD. So welcome for this release of the report. We have a wonderful panel with people, with experts, with activists who were very active in putting together this report. And of course, we'll have with us Beth Ferris, who put it together, who wrote the report. First of all, before I introduce you to the panel, let me give the floor to Lloyd Axworthy. He's the president of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and Lloyd is, of course, the co-chair, the Canadian co-chair of this North and Central American Task Force on Migration. Not only that, Lloyd was a Canadian foreign minister, and he has been an inspiration for a lot of us. He's been an endless, I would say, warrior for human rights, for multilateral affairs. So thank you, Lloyd, for joining us, and thank you for leading this effort. So I'll give you the floor, and the idea is that you could tell us a little bit about this task force, and if you want to say something about the report, you're more than welcome. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you for being with us. Yours is the floor, Lloyd.
Rafael, thank you for those very kind words. And I'm really quite pleased to be able to say a few opening remarks about the launch of this first report from the Americas Task Force. The task force really was born out of discussions that you and I had with others from, as you point out, from the Inter-American Dialogue and Migration Policy Institute, El Colegio de Mexico, because we really felt that the dialogue and conversation around the migration issue was not getting the kind of prominence nor imagination and fresh look that it required. And one of the things that struck us is that the opportunity to help shape a regional, hemispheric, collegial strategy needs to be properly addressed, that this is not an issue. The large numbers, the dire conditions, the propelling driving forces that cause large-scale migration cannot be handled in a unilateral or even a bilateral way. It's got to be something that really does fix a multi-task approach, one that is really founded on the principle of responsibility sharing. As you mentioned, when I was foreign minister, I sort of was able to get the United Nations back in a period of time to adopt what we call the responsibility to protect. And it was simply a fundamental principle that if governments on their own or in small clusters can't protect their citizens, then it's up to a larger community, an international community, to come in and provide assistance and support and resources. I think this first report is just one of several to come. We have this incredibly talented and experienced task force, some 15 to 20 members who bring not only a knowledge, but also a sense of activism to the idea that we really have to find the ways of working in a collaborative way. And I think that this first report dealing with the need for humanitarian protection really sets the stage, because it just gives a description of both the kind of conditions being faced by people on the move and the necessity of really providing effective and proper and timely responses. we hope that these reports and the advocacy that goes with them will be picked up by respective governments, by people in civil society, in the churches, in professional societies, private sector. This is something that is bigger than all of us, and I think therefore it needs us all to kind of work together in a unified team away. I won't spill the beans as to what all the recommendations are. I think Beth will be able to lead us and guide us, but I simply want to underline that this is an ongoing, continuing commitment, and this is the first of what I hope will be an effective series that would come together, would outline that kind of hemispheric strategy that I talked about in the opening. So I hope that I know this panel will be able to really highlight and underline the urgency and the importance and the ideas that need to be brought to bear. I'm grateful for the participation, and I look forward to the session and the follow-up. And we hope that this will just be the beginning of many further opportunities to put into the public arena serious new ideas about how we can work together in this America's context. So thank you, Raphael, and back to you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Let me introduce you the panelists. And first of all, let me introduce you. I already talked to you about Beth Ferris. She's Vice President of Research of the World Refugee and Migration Council, and she's also professor at Georgetown. Beth has been doing this extraordinary effort to put together these reports. Thank you, Beth, and I will give you first the floor, but let me introduce the rest of the panelists who work closely with Beth to make sure that we will have today the release of this report. First of all, let me introduce you to Mayu Brizuela Avila. She is a wonderful friend from El Salvador. She was the first woman foreign minister. She was the first woman in El Salvador who became a president of a bank, and she is very active in civil society. She is in boards of very important international NGOs, and she's basically connecting Central America to the world and to the global NGOs. Welcome, Mayu, and thank you for your leadership as well. Mayu is the Central American co-chair of this task force. We also have with us Ana Saez. Ana is a distinguished Mexican lawyer. She's the president of Sin Fronteras, a very important, I would say, influential NGO on migration-related issues. And she has experience both in private sector and in public policy, and she's a champion of human and civil rights in Mexico and in Latin America. Thank you, Ana, for joining us and for all your help in putting together this report. And we also have Noah Bullock, and Noah is the director of Cristosal in Central America. He's a champion of human rights in the region, and thank you, Noah, for joining us and for being so helpful in putting together this report. Let me give the floor to you, Beth, and let me remind all of you that we have interpretation. If you want to listen to this in Spanish, go in the bottom of your screen and use the interpretation button, and you could switch it either in English or in Spanish. Most of us, we're going to be speaking in English, but if you want to listen to this in Spanish, we have this interpretation function, so just go ahead and use the interpretation feature of this webinar. Beth, you seize the floor, and thank you very much for leading this effort and to putting together this report.
Thanks, Rafa, for hosting this webinar. Opportunity to talk about one of the first products of our work. The work of the task force is really going to focus on 6 areas: humanitarian protection in the region, but also the question of regional co-responsibility. How can we strengthen ways to share responsibility for migration in the region from Canada to Panama? Then we'll be looking at economic and environmental drivers of displacement and migration, as well as institutional institutional, political drivers, including accountability, rule of law, corruption, gang violence, etc. We'll be looking at alternative, safe, orderly migration pathways to prevent some of these very dangerous journeys, and then looking at issues around the narrative of migration and integration of migrants and refugees in the societies in which they're living. The group decided to start with humanitarian protection in the region because some of the issues are just so urgent. And in this report, and our panelists will speak in more detail in response to questions, and we focused on 4 issues. First, we looked at women and children, the extraordinary levels of domestic violence, gender-based violence against women, the serious protection needs faced by children, which are directly related to people feeling that they have to leave their countries and their communities in search of safety. We made a lot of recommendations without going into them all, just to highlight a couple. With respect to women, we thought it was really important to transfer the impetus for addressing protection needs of women and children to women's organizations in the region. So we call for a regional network to consider what are the strategies and activities needed to improve the security of both women and children. We also call for the deployment of regional observer missions to look at the state of child protection in Central America and Mexico, to identify ways, shortcomings, and things that need to be done to ensure that children, often the most vulnerable members of a society, aren't forced to leave their communities in search of safety. A second issue is internal displacement, and Noah, who's been a real leader on this issue in El Salvador and the region, can speak more. But, you know, we hear a lot about what's happening at the US-Mexico border. We don't hear so much about the likely hundreds of thousands of people that have been forced to leave their communities but haven't crossed an international border. We know there's a relationship. People who can't find safety at home are more likely to seek it abroad. And so what are some ways that we can address internal displacement? And there we call for not just coming up with new laws and policies for IDPs, as they're called, but actually committing the resources to ensure that those who are forced to flee their communities get the protection and assistance they need. Third, we look at the issue of asylum capacity in the region. And this goes from Canada, the United States, Mexico, all through Central America. Again, there's a lot of attention on people at the US-Mexico border. But you look at countries like Mexico and Costa Rica that have seen a dramatic upsurge in the number of asylum seekers, and how can governments be supported to ensure that the asylum processes are fair and efficient and are able to deal with those who come? Finally, we looked at the desperate situation of many migrants in transit, those who, particularly through Mexico and Guatemala, who have experienced sometimes horrific situations of abuse and not enough shelters. And we heard from shelters in the region about the particular pressures caused by COVID, you know, trying to maintain safety and social distancing while dealing with more migrants who are coming and fewer resources. And there we talked about the need for access to vaccines, for consular services to step up their work dealing with migrants who are detained and otherwise suffer at the hands in transit. So we'll hear from panelists about all of this. I commend the panel for its work. People have been very engaged and eager to come up with bold ideas to make a difference in terms of addressing migration from Central America and Mexico in our region. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That's a wonderful summary of our report. And let me welcome Andrew Seeley, the president of the Migration Policy Institute. We know that that's the go-to place when we need to find out ideas and research on migration-related issues. Welcome, Andrew. And we'll give him the floor to make a summary and to give the conclusions of this report, but if you want to weigh in anytime, Andrew. So let me start with you, Mayu. Why don't you react to what Beth has to say? I mean, what is what you will emphasize out of our report? And then, obviously, I will ask you a few questions about gender-related issues, about violence against migrants in transit. But why don't we start with your reaction of what Beth had to say?
Thank you so very much, Rafael. I am truly honored to be part of this fantastic group that brings in so much expertise from various areas that touch upon the migration issue. So the point I would like to really make known about the report that Beth so elegantly and wisely has put together is the way that the report suggests a layered approach. What does that mean? It's the way that we're looking at working at different levels of supporting, first of all, the grassroots initiatives, because we are looking first to the protection of the people in their own communities, because that's where root cause situations drive people out. So we have to be able to support those grassroots initiatives and refugee-led organizations that are there working at local level that would become even a preventive method. Second, in regards to this layer, is that when they are displaced within their own countries, of which I, again, being a Salvadoran, recognize so much of the work NOAA carries on. And so that's an intermediate part as people start moving, but then they transit through other countries. And when they reach also the country of destination. So in a meaningful way of seeing this change, from national government policies to strengthening the broader regional initiatives, the cross-border situations, I think this report, by bringing that view, allows us to focus even more on protecting people in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayu. Let me go to you, Ana. You've been, Sin Fronteras has been dealing with a lot of refugee-related issues. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what is in the report about asylum and how you see the asylum and the refugee capacity of Mexico. And thank you, Ana. Ana, before you start talking, let me remind to everybody participating in this webinar that we have a Q&A function, preguntas y respuestas. So please, if you want to send us a question, if you want to interact with us, we want to make this as interactive as possible. Please use that function, send your questions, and the panelists will be able to answer to you either in writing or I will read the question. Sorry, Ana, but now you can go ahead.
Muchas gracias, Rafa. I'm going to speak in Spanish this time, but I hope everybody finds the correct translation. So, pues ha sido una reflexión muy interesante, la verdad, todo un reto encontrar estas situaciones más inmediatas que encontramos como áreas de oportunidad para mejorar la situación en toda nuestra región. Sin duda, entendemos que se tiene el asilo o el dar y recibir asilo, esta obligación estatal, si bien cada estado tiene su propia obligación, sí vemos totalmente necesario abordarlo de una manera conjunta, de una manera regional y de una manera colaborativa. Entonces, hemos desarrollado algunas recomendaciones más específicas específicamente para algunos países, porque como bien ya lo dijo Beth, mucha de esta carga actualmente está recayendo tanto en México como en Costa Rica y tenemos estas restricciones actualmente por la pandemia tanto en Estados Unidos como en Canadá que tienen que irse resolviendo justamente para armar estos sistemas colaborativos que son tan importantes para poder atender este tipo de cuestiones. Ahora, sí, nosotros hemos visto esta evolución que vino desde la administración Trump y en donde se fueron acumulando históricamente en la frontera sur de Estados Unidos muchos solicitantes de asilo, personas que buscaban protección internacional, y cómo ha ido cambiando paulatinamente a partir de la entrada de la nueva administración en Estados Unidos, que hemos visto cancelación del programa inhumano que ocasionó un tremendo sufrimiento conocido como MPP o Quédate en México, que se llegaron a acumular hasta 70,000 personas esperando sus casos de asilo. Ya se han ido incorporando, han ido recuperando los trámites, algunas de estas personas, y nos parece muy importante continuar con este tipo de esfuerzos y sobre todo detectar que las restricciones puestas por la COVID-19 han limitado también la capacidad de acceso al territorio de personas solicitantes de asilo, que su intención es pedir este tipo de protección internacional tanto en Estados Unidos como en Canadá. Entonces, sí nos parece muy importante hacer este llamado a la cooperación regional. El número de casos tanto en Centroamérica, de personas centroamericanas que han solicitado asilo, particularmente en México, ha incrementado exponencialmente desde 2017, que han sido más o menos 50,000, ha subido hasta 250,000. Entonces, el crecimiento es exponencial. En Estados Unidos la situación también ha sido un aumento sostenido desde 2015, que va desde 400,000 hasta 1,200,000 personas. Entonces, sin embargo, Canadá no ha registrado estos aumentos tan significativos. Entonces, sí nos parece importante llamar la atención sobre los rezagos que hay en la solución de los casos, particularmente en México y en Estados Unidos. También Costa Rica presenta un rezago importante que es una de las cosas en las que esta Task Force quiere poner la atención de las personas. Entonces, sí nos parece muy importante tratar de dar este acompañamiento a mecanismos regionales como son los MIRPs en toda la región, que buscan aterrizar la situación de la Declaración de Cartagena, atender los desplazamientos por violencia generalizada en la región, y no podemos dejar a un lado la gran devastación que dejaron los dos recientes huracanes Zeta y Iota, que han también impulsado a muchas personas a tratar de desplazarse pues simplemente para salvar su vida. Entonces, queremos hacer estas 7 recomendaciones muy concretas a los gobiernos, y la primera es que revisen la legislación que regule el asilo, particularmente los reglamentos y las que son disposiciones administrativas que no tienen estos procesos legislativos, que creemos que podrían ayudar mucho a paliar los rezagos. Por ejemplo, en México es una legislación que data desde 2012, es un reglamento que data de 2012, y sí tenemos que actualizarlo de manera urgente para quitar muchas trabas que ya realmente son completamente inoperantes. Y Estados Unidos tendría que trabajar en acelerar la eliminación de las restricciones impuestas ante la COVID-19 para tener acceso al territorio y poder tener acceso a los procedimientos de protección internacional y de asilo. Ahora, llamamos también a asegurarse a los gobiernos que el personal encargado de las fronteras estén debidamente capacitados en materia de asilo y protección internacional. Por ejemplo, en México es muy importante en los aeropuertos tener acceso a procedimientos de asilo. En los gobiernos de Estados Unidos y Canadá hacemos un llamado para inmediatamente eliminar las excepciones o restringirlas al máximo impuestas por la COVID-19 por este acceso al territorio. Como número 4, llamamos a limitar al máximo la detención migratoria y bajo ninguna circunstancia detener niñas, niños y adolescentes. No está justificado bajo ninguna circunstancia. Como recomendación número 5, buscamos dotar a las oficinas, a las diversas instituciones de asilo en la región con el respaldo político y presupuestal que necesitan para responder a la situación y terminar con este rezago injustificado, y también poder atender los casos de asilo de manera oportuna y procesarlos. Como número 6, y ya lo adelantaban al principio, la participación de la sociedad civil organizada es clave y debe tener participación en la toma de decisiones, en la determinación de este tipo de procedimientos. Y muchas veces estos mecanismos ya existen, están instalados en distintos gobiernos, pero no se utilizan y se deben de utilizar. Incluso aunque estemos en medio de una pandemia, hay los mecanismos que se pueden solventar para hacer este tipo de participaciones. Y como número 7, pues llamamos a los actores regionales y a los gobiernos a respaldar y a financiar los esfuerzos innovadores, encontrar soluciones, apoyar los programas de reasentamiento y colaboraciones técnicas que permitan tener compartir información en materia de asilo para poderlos ir abordando de una manera mucho más regional y colaborativa. Creo que hasta aquí lo dejamos, Rafa.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Yes. Now let's go to Noah Bullock. Noah, I wonder if you have you want to emphasize or underline something about the report that we're releasing, but we want to ask you as well. I mean, there's a big issue in terms of displacement, not only in Central America. This is also happening in Mexico. So I wonder if you could give us your sense of what is the internal displacement, and are there ways to go about trying to solve or easing this problem?
Yeah, thank you, Rafa. Thanks for inviting me to this panel, and saludos to my fellow panelists. It's good to see everybody this morning, afternoon, depending where you are. I think that what's important about displacement being a part of this report is the centrality to displacement as part of a cycle of human mobility in the region. We know from our work in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala that displacement is a resource that Central Americans use when they have protection needs. And it's also something that's like an antesala. It's a previous stage to cross-border movements, or a resource that Central Americans look to upon being returned to their countries of origin when they have persisting protection needs, unresolved humanitarian needs. So that's to say that people displaced both before cross-border movements and upon being returned or deported back to their countries of origin. So that is an important framing of displacement as part of a regional protection response. We know, for example, with Crystal Sal, last year, 22% of the cases of people who were returned to Honduras and Guatemala during the pandemic reported having been displaced previously to having left their country. And upon coming back, were unable to go back to their countries. So what we see is an opportunity to intervene and interrupt the displacement cycle before it becomes part of a transnational border or regional problem. If we can assist people before they abandon their homes, we also think reintegration in their countries is more viable. When people make the decision to leave, they often sacrifice resources and invest a great deal of their personal capital in a transnational immigration attempt, which makes them less likely to be able to have resources to reintegrate in the case that that attempt fails. So addressing displacement, assisting people before they get into that level of vulnerability could be an opportunity. I'll just say briefly a little bit about displacement and how it's changed in this sort of post-pandemic world. A lot of people have focused on homicide rates in Central America as sort of a be-all and end-all indicator of security in the region. But we've noticed, as we've been monitoring displacement for multiple years, that homicide rates don't necessarily correlate with internal displacement. When people displace inside of their countries because of security reasons, we notice it's really more of a calculation about what they think the capacity of criminal organizations that persecute them are, the likelihood of receiving any sort of assistance, be it from the state or otherwise, and their own personal resources and resilience to confront the threats and find solutions. Those are the three factors. Homicide rates don't necessarily correlate with the strength of criminal organizations in the territory. I'll give you El Salvador as an example where we've seen homicide reduction at high levels. But even last year during the pandemic, we saw that 1% of the population reported in a national survey having had to displace internally because of security problems last year. So that's about 130,000 people. So I think we need to look beyond the homicide rates to see the importance of a protection response and a displacement response. And specifically, I think as you mentioned in your opening comments, also learning more about climate-driven displacement, especially as we see in northern Honduras and the Caribbean coast of Guatemala, northern Guatemala, communities that last year were destroyed by 2 subsequent hurricanes. So we have a diversity of drivers and triggers of displacement. And unfortunately in the region, we have a lack of political will of the states to see displacement response as a priority within security strategies, or in the case of climate-induced displacement, to be forward-looking and creating comprehensive climate strategies and assistance for populations that are affected. We have in El Salvador a law that was passed in 2019, an internal displacement law, but subsequently we see reductions in budgets, allocations to victim assistance programs in the region. So one of the lessons learned in the region has been that achieving normative change has not necessarily correlated into political will to prioritize displacement response. And I think that in the region, the understanding of the state's responsibility for protection has often been limited to protecting people who are collaborating in penal cases for the duration of those trials, or in some cases, very specialized programs for women and children, but really comprehensive protection responses that include emergency shelter or emergency humanitarian assistance, relocation and reintegration. We don't see programs like that existing at the state level yet. This report has 3 recommendations to try and address the situation or the opportunity, as I was trying to point out at the beginning, to assist displaced people before they become forced to cross borders. And the first one's oriented towards normative change. And I do think that normative change is an important tool for states to assume responsibility to protect people beyond the limited scope of sort of victims or witnesses in penal trials, and to be able to get states to recognize their responsibility for more comprehensive protection responses, but also an important tool for states to begin to incorporate displacement responses as a priority within their security strategies, which has definitely been one of the areas where they've lacked. If we could get states to invest in programs to assist victims at the levels that they continue to increase funding allocations to the military and the security forces, we might begin to see different outcomes. So I think the normative change is a way of beginning that conversation and building commitment. And so that's our first recommendation, is for the international community, civil society, to encourage, to pressure states to recognize and bring their normative structures in line with international standards on displacement response. The second recommendation we have is for the international community to provide resources to the local governments at the local level and technical assistance to increase sort of local protection responses. And I think this is an important learning that we've had in the last few years. We know that the protection needs or the humanitarian needs of every individual case are expansive and diverse. And so we need an increasing number of actors involved in building protection solutions. And so that's why we think getting resources at the local level can help us tailor those responses in a more strategic way. And I would add onto this as a kind of a personal lesson learned, is that the need for being able to have capacities or resources available for really individualized case management, helping internally displaced people and families think through their own resources and options, connecting to other ones that are existing, and avoiding trying to create these specialized programs for displaced people that create like a kind of a separate category. What we're trying to do is eliminate the barriers that exist for displaced people to access existing resources. And oftentimes—
Could you wrap up, please?
Yeah, sure. And the last recommendation we have was to the national governments as well sorry, I'm going to bring it up because I can't remember it off the top of my head, or the donor governments and regional organizations to support civil society responses. We know that building political will for robust and integrated displacement responses takes a long, long time. And in the meantime, we have real humanitarian needs in the region. So we are calling on donor governments to provide the support needed for civil society-led displacement response. Sorry for going over the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. We have quite a few questions from the public attending. One is from Fikret Deshay from the Financial Times. I will read it to all the panelists. Have the recommendations in the Global Compact for Refugees been of any effect to address the challenge in Central America and the region as a whole? If some of you want to answer this question, I will appreciate. Andrew Seal is here. Andrew, I wonder if you want to emphasize some of the recommendations of the report, and then I will give the floor to Mayo Brizuela, because we want to talk about especially gender issues and about how to better protect. Go ahead, Andrew, please.
Thank you. Okay. Rafael, let me just be very quick in summarizing a few points here. Let me say, first of all, I think we are talking about moving towards a situation of layered protection. As Beth said early on, I mean, where we're thinking there isn't a single way of protecting people, but there are people with protection needs. We want to be able to identify people as early as possible before people feel they need to flee, but also make sure there's safeguards along the way for those that flee, who are able to then seek asylum in other countries. And so this means looking at what we just heard Noah talk about, internal displacement, how you make sure that some of the existing efforts that NGOs are doing come together with the laws that are on the books or are under debate in countries in the region, to make sure that people have access to protection within their own countries for those who have the opportunity to do that. That will not work for everyone, but for some people it will. How do we identify people using the refugee resettlement system internationally before they need to flee as well? There's a small number of people who perhaps can be identified who are not able to stay in their country and be able to get them out. There is an existing pathway that has done some of this that can be plussed up. How do we strengthen the asylum systems in Mexico and Costa Rica and Panama and in the United States, so that people can arrive, can receive a timely and fair judgment, timely and fair decision around asylum, and can also be integrated in the country of refuge once that's decided. And I should say also through MERPS, I mean, there's also, I think, a real conversation about strengthening asylum systems in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We haven't taken that seriously because there was an attempt in a past administration in the US to force people to go through the asylum systems of those countries. But in reality, there's a very small number of people for whom it actually makes sense. I encountered a family recently in Guatemala who were from Honduras and had connected with a church community in Guatemala and wanted to settle down and seek asylum there. Was not able to return for Honduras for safety reasons, but did not want to continue on to Mexico. I think those are a small number of cases. We should never assume that people are safe seeking asylum elsewhere in the Northern Triangle, but it should be possible and it should be an alternative for people as well. Secondly, let me say we should think about protection within the context of legal pathways more broadly. We need to have robust, and we're going to talk about this with the task force, as Rafael and Beth said early on. We're going to talk about various forms of legal pathways along the way, but obviously we need to think about protection pathways as well as employment-based pathways. And there are many people who would probably be better off pursuing employment-based pathways, but may have protection needs as well, right? And so having both of those as part of a strategy matter. Third, I would say we're moving from thinking about migration control to thinking of migration management, which is not how do we stop people from moving, but how do we make sure that people move along pathways that are fair, transparent, legal, safe, and beginning to have that conversation. And final point, I would say, drawing from what's been said by all the panelists, is this is something that requires cooperation from all corners, from Canada to Costa Rica. There are parts that we've talked about, and from government and from civil society. So there are parts that we've talked about that could be done by Canada and the US, refugee resettlement, for example. There are other parts that clearly have to be done in El Salvador and Honduras, but have to be done by government and civil society, in which Canada and the US and maybe Mexico play a supporting role, right? And perhaps a strong financing role and a supporting role through international organizations, through UNHCR and IOM. But all of these things, if you put it together, it is a complex puzzle that needs all of the countries involved and needs different parts of government and different parts of civil society working to put that puzzle together, right? And that, I think, is what needs to be built. It's something we are not set up to do. It's not something that normally we've thought of in the past, but unless we think from Canada to Costa Rica, it's going to be very hard to put this together in a way that functions to make sure that people who need protection are protected as early as possible. And certainly, you know, as early as possible before they flee, and if they have to flee once they've gotten to a place of refuge. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me give the floor to you, Mayu, because you've been very concerned about gender issues, about, yes, and there's a question here in the Q&A also about indigenous populations. So we know there's some, I mean, migrants in transit, they're very vulnerable, but especially children, women, and indigenous populations. So what is your take on this, Mayu, and what is what we can do to better protect women?
Thank you so very much, Rafael. I will address specifically the report's urgency, because that's the point that's most important. It's the urgency of the protection of women, of children, and other groups of greatest risk in Central America and Mexico, including such as transit migrants. You know, because there is a recognition we have to make. Gender-based violence and violence against children and adolescents in North Central America is very high. 1 in 3 women have had experiences in violence in the world, but in my home country, in El Salvador, that's 7 to 10. You know, it's more than, you know, in an enormous population. So we have the highest rates of feminicide, both in Honduras and in El Salvador. So children are at risk of abuse, of abandonment. UNICEF states, you know, that almost half of the Guatemalan children suffer from chronic malnutrition, and that there's sufficient evidence that that desire to protect your children is one of the main reasons why families decide to leave their homes or to send their children off to seek protection, especially if they have someone in the States and they're seeking family reunification. So I do believe that the recommendations of the task force of increasing protection of women and children, including indigenous populations, is very important. First is that we ask women's organizations to organize a regional network meeting within the next year. Why is it important we talk about local? Because although many actions have been taken, you know, many times organizations that were giving the programs were unfamiliar with the special local circumstances and conditions. Others operate at arm's length and consume scarce resources that could be more effectively deployed by local actors. Second recommendation is that we call on the governments in the region to reduce the horrific levels of violence against women. How? By improving and expanding your access to services for all women and girls, that we also enhance training of police officers and the development of a cadre specialized in sexual, political, and domestic violence, that we're able to recruit more women into law enforcement and ensure that judicial systems are placed to punish the perpetrators of violence against women. Third is that authorities who fail to comply should be subject to effective sanctions. Fourth is that we urge the support for civil society organizations, which are assisting women who are experiencing violence, and we need them to support with more social workers and psychologists, you know, because mental health also is very important. Fifth, as Beth has also already stated, you know, in collaboration with regional organizations, we're calling for the immediate deployment of regional observer missions so that we can assess on site how the child protection systems are working in each of the countries and bring in recommendations. And finally, there has to be a recognition of the potential value of a regional system of child protection. And here UNICEF, you know, together with child-centered NGOs, you know, they must convene in a way that we can find community-led mechanisms to protect displaced and migrant children. And I'm talking just internally displaced as migrants also en route. And in this regard, also, I would like to just add 2 more points that are magnified in the report. One has to do also with missing migrants. Missing migrants is also a situation that is lived in the International Commission on Missing Persons. Also stresses, you know, the fact of this it's not only a humanitarian obligation, it's a legal obligation of the states. And finally, the migrants in transit. Migrants in transits where we find, you know, like surveys by Médecins Sans Frontières that where they found, 39% of Central American migrants were assaulted in Mexico. 27% were threatened and extorted. So those who are en route also, we must be able to level a certain protection for them. So we call on all governments, countries that through which migrants are transiting to take every possible step to ensure their safety through enhanced law enforcement and prosecutions of those charged with crimes against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayu. We're entering in the we only have 14 minutes to go. So, and there's quite a few questions. Orlando Pavon asked you, Noah Bullock, I mean, what about organized crime? He says, some countries, they decided to put their armed forces to combat organized crime. What is your take on that? Well, let me start by giving the floor to Beth Ferris, the author of the report. Beth, what else would you emphasize about the report? And there's quite a few questions about violence. And why don't you give us a sense of when the next reports are coming, so we don't have to answer questions that will be answered by the next reports.
And for this report as well, we'll circulate right after this meeting links to both the Spanish and English versions of the report to all the participants, because there's a lot more in there. Our next report is going to be on regional responsibility, followed by one on institutional corruption. One of the issues is that all of these issues are interrelated. I mean, economic and political and humanitarian protection in the region. The issue of indigenous people is going to be raised a little later. I also just want to stress we heard from many groups in Central America and Mexico that the space for civil society action is shrinking. That civil society organizations sometimes feel threatened, or the existing consultative mechanisms aren't being used with an excuse perhaps of COVID restrictions. But I mean, we really want to affirm the essential role that civil society plays in these situations, particularly when you're dealing with people at risk. But let me pass it on then to Noah to talk more about internal displacement, which deserves a lot more attention.
Go ahead, please, Noah, and then we'll go to Anna Saiz, and of course we will ask her about how she feels about civil society organizations in Mexico, because yes, there's been some, I would say at least misunderstandings with the current government. So we'll ask you how you feel about this. Noah, yours is the floor. Then we'll go to Andrew, and also I will give the floor to Lloyd Axworthy, so you can close, Lloyd. But, Noah, what is your take on this? And yes, internal displacement is quite an issue here.
Yeah, maybe just to respond quickly to the question from David Orlando about the use of the armed forces in terms of controlling immigration or combating organized criminal activity that happens around migratory flows. I think it's an important trend to recognize that starting during the Trump administration, the Guatemalan armed forces, even the Honduran armed forces, have been used at the borders to stop caravans or other groups of people trying to leave the country. And I think that is not, I think that what it does is gives you short-term impacts in terms of being able to stop some outflows of people, but it doesn't produce any solutions. And what it does is create increased vulnerabilities for people who are desperately seeking solutions. So while I think the armed forces have a role constitutionally mandated in countries for national defense, I don't think that they're the most appropriate branch of the state in terms of helping produce solutions for people fleeing violence or even affected by organized crime. Mentioning human trafficking or human slavery, those are some of the consequences of a vulnerable group of people without options, fleeing their countries, crossing borders. And I don't think the armed forces offer much of a solution to them either. I think that consistent due process-based law enforcement can help to counter impunity for organized criminal groups. I think that this is one of the relationships with that the Biden administration tries to make between migration and corruption and impunity as an underlying cause. I alluded to this in terms of making the relationship between or differentiating between homicide rates as an indicator that correlates with increased immigration or displacement. But what we're talking about is the ability to control territory, to exert sovereignty and rule of law in territories. And that's what needs to be approached. I think we need to look at corruption, organized crime at a grand level, and strengthen simultaneously to protection responses, strategies to combat corruption and impunity in the region.
Thank you, Noah. In one of the questions or one of the comments, our dear friend Claire Silke from the Congressional Research Project is asking us if we're willing to talk to members of Congress in the US Capitol, and I'm telling her we'll be very pleased to do that because we know that that's a key place to go and to try to get to meaningful answers and responses to these to these issues that have been affecting us for many, many years now. Anna, why don't you give us a sense of how civil society feels in Mexico, not only in Mexico, but in Central America? How, I mean, how's the atmosphere for civil society to work and to help really to manage these migrant flows? Because I believe that, for example, here in Tijuana, the border city with San Diego, I would say without civil society, it will be chaos on managing migration flows. They've been doing an extraordinary effort to help the local authorities and the state authorities, and I believe it's a must to have the help of civic organizations in handling these migration flows. Go ahead, Anna, please.
Thank you, Rafa. Well, the report is very clear in that sense. I mean, it is an obligation, a due obligation of governments to protect people. And since they are not being able to do the task, civil society has been doing that in all the region, and that's important. I want to stress very much the participation of shelters among protecting migrants and how they work in organized networks. So they have this system for protecting migrants moving from one shelter to another, even crossing borders. So that's a very, very specific effort that needs to be addressed. Also, civil society is willing to help with all this migration management system and all these new solutions or finding these legal pathways. And we do want to participate, even though the government, we have mixed messages. On the one hand, we have, for example, from the Mañanera, the highest levels, even the president saying that civil society is not reliable. And on the other hand, we have other instances of government asking for the help. And for example, now that they cannot detain children in detention facilities, the Instituto Nacional de Migración is translating children to shelter, and they are not funding this kind of shelters. So that is the case. For example, now I just returned in Monterrey. That's the case in Monterrey. They are just moving children and pregnant women there, and they are not funding these efforts. And I think in all the region, all the burden on taxes and administrative new regulations are really, really making the efforts for NGO very, very hard for civil society to do our work. And also the issue of protection that it's also highlighted in the report. You have it there. We need to have guarantees for doing our job. Thanks, Rafa.
Thank you, Anna. And let me give the floor to Andrew Seeley. Andrew, what will be your conclusions of this report, and what is what you want to emphasize? And then we'll ask Lloyd Axworthy to close this. And thank you all for participating. I mean, this is only the first of the reports that the North and Central American Task Force on Migration is putting together. And there's many institutions involved in this: the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies, the Inter-American Dialogue, the Migration Policy Institute, El Colegio de México in Mexico City, and of course, the World Refugee and Migration Council led by Lloyd Axworthy. So Andrew, yours is the floor, and then we'll give the floor to Lloyd to close.
since I spoke already, let me just underline two things that have been said, and then let's pass it off to Lloyd Axworthy, who really has been the inspiration for this effort and for this task force. I would say again, there is a need to think cooperatively in a way that we haven't in the past, in a way that doesn't work naturally for governments in the region. The U.S. and Canada do talk to each other about refugee resettlement, but we don't necessarily talk in fluid ways about protection writ large, right? I mean, we talk about specific things. The U.S. and Mexico talk about, Mexico's asylum system or the U.S. asylum system, but thinking writ large is not something we tend to do. This is a moment where we need to break the patterns of the past and figure out a new institutionality in how we talk to each other, particularly around protection issues, but also around legal pathways and many other things that are going to be necessary to manage migration and manage protection issues from Canada to Costa Rica. This is a moment of crisis, as the report says. So I think one is, how do we change this architecture, and how do we change the natural inertia that exists and between government and civil society, which is another one where it does not come naturally. Many of the protection pathways are being done on an ad hoc basis by civil society within Central America and within Mexico. And so how do you actually create a synergy between what the law says and allows and what the institutionality allows and what's already going on the ground? And secondly is beginning to create this layered protection architecture, which is beginning to look at multiple ways of intervening so that people get humanitarian protection as early as possible, but also making sure those fail-safes are there so people can seek asylum if they have to flee. And so beginning to build this in a broad way, understanding people have different needs for protection at different moments, and that this has to be thought of in an integral way. And with that, I think let's hear from Honorable Lloyd Axworthy.
Lloyd? Unmute, please.
Okay. So a few words of benediction to this a wonderful assembly. In my religious faith, the United Church of Canada, benediction is always accompanied by a collection plate, so that it's an ability to get some resources to work to actually make things happen. And I think it was Mai who said that this is an urgency, and it really does require to break out of a lot of the conventional sort of routines and attitudes. The key is how to do it, and I think that's the whole point. How do you mobilize a political will? And one way of doing it is to actually demonstrate that they're different layered, targeted approaches can work, can be successful. And there are models out there, I think, that the task force is examining to say, how do you translate what we've heard today? I mean, I think the whole notion of the working from 20,000 feet down to ground level, from the airy heights of the global compacts, I think was one of the questions, down to actual implementation of local people to deal with issues of asylum, issues of protection, issues of support. And I do recall, Raphael, just as 2 years ago, you invited me to come to your center, and we visited the camps along the border in Tijuana. And I remember probably the most stark reminder was women and children who had come to the border on the grounds that at the time the United States was accepting violence, domestic violence and gang violence as a criteria, which had then just been canceled. That's now been resuscitated. But I think there's a lot of people out there who've been left hanging without that kind of resources. And that's where I think the idea of the direct involvement of assistance and is absolutely kind of crucial. And I think that this is a task force about action. And I think that's going to be one of the major questions about what are the models, what are the ways in which we can both build on the existing architecture, but maybe also begin to think about what new architecture do we need to make this work. I have to say that I'm so admiring of the comments that have been made. I just wish we had several more hours, because I think many of you have really diagnosed the analytics so well, and then also brought to me a sense of, like, I have to say, a frustration that we aren't doing more right now to make it happen. But I hope this is a good entry into getting that kind of action organized, and that I say I hope there's some people in government listening.
Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Mayo Brizuela. Thank you, Noah Bullock. Thank you, Ana Mercedes Ice. Thank you, Andrew Silic, and especially to you, Beth Ferris, for putting together this report. And this is the first report of the North and Central American Task Force on Migration. There's two coming. The next one will be on regional cooperation and co-responsibility, and the next one on democracy, corruption, and accountability. So thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and the weekend is coming. Thank you all.